Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 24th of April. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 425 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Russia has switched to defensive positions in all its areas of combat, apart from Bakhmut, according to the Ukrainian head of intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov. Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic, has said that the situation in Bakhmut continues to be tense, but that Wagner Group forces have made some advances. Ukraine's military appears to have set up positions on the eastern side of the Dnipro River near Kherson city, the Institute for the Study of War cites Russian military bloggers as saying. Infiltrating the area could be a first step towards trying to dislodge Russians from positions they are using to shell and shoot at Kherson. Ukrainian authorities say that Russian troops are forcibly evacuating civilians in the area of Kherson region that they still occupy, a day after it was claimed that Ukrainian forces had established a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Dnipro. Russia's Black Sea Fleet came under Ukrainian drone attack in the Crimean port of Sevastopol in the early hours of today. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said China respects the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of all countries and upholds the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, has spoken after his son confirmed that he had fought for Russia in the war in Ukraine. In an interview in Komsomolskaya Pravda on Sunday, Nikolai Peskov said he had served as an artilleryman in the Wagner mercenary group. More than 300 foreign correspondents who have worked in Moscow have written to the Russian government to call for the immediate release of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter currently being held on espionage charges. Russia is using passports as a tool in the Russification of parts of occupied Ukraine, the UK's Ministry of Defence has said in its latest intelligence update. The former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, said that if the G7 moved to ban exports to Russia, Moscow would respond by terminating the Black Sea grain deal that enables vital exports of grain from Ukraine. Europe's military spending grew at a record pace in 2022, reaching $2.24 trillion, a level not seen since the Cold War following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia is advising its citizens to avoid travel to Canada. Moscow cited what it called numerous cases of discrimination against its citizens, including physical violence, its foreign ministry said. And anti-Kremlin protesters staged a rally in Paris yesterday, urging the EU to impose sanctions on the socialite wife of the Russian Deputy Defence Minister, whom they accuse of bypassing sanctions. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by a regular friend to the programme. William Duguid is an activist, a commentator and a blogger, and he also helps to run the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, good evening. It's a while since you and I have spoken. How are you keeping?
I'm just fine. I've been on a few times since I was last on with you, but glad to be back with you now, Andrew, and I hope you're keeping well too.
Thank you, William, and it's a pleasure to see you. Our first story this evening is that our First Minister has been in London today, where he is meeting the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in person for the first time this evening. He has also held meetings with key ambassadors to the UK, including from Germany and Ukraine, and also with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. When he meets the Prime Minister, the First Minister will call for the Scotch whisky industry to be treated fairly, as he raises the issue of disproportionate tax increases and the absence of energy cost support. In a surprise move made without consultation, last month's UK budget saw Scotch whisky hit with a 10.1% tax increase. The increase is compounded by the exclusion of distillers, alone in the drinks industry, from the energy bill relief offered by the UK government. Whisky production is inevitably an energy-intensive process, and the Scotch Whisky Association reports that 2/3 of distillers have said that their costs will go up, leading to less investment. Commenting ahead of his meeting with the Prime Minister, Mr. Yousaf said, "Whisky has to pay its fair share of tax. Everyone, including the distillers, agrees on that. The decision, however, to increase tax by more than 10% at the same time as refusing to provide the energy bill support the rest of the drinks industry receives puts the industry and Scotland at a competitive disadvantage. That means less investment and puts jobs at risk here in Scotland. That is simply unacceptable. What's more, this is a direct breach of an explicit pledge the Prime Minister was elected on as an MP in 2019. The Conservative manifesto was clear that they would review duty to help support the Scotch whisky industry. Instead, yet again, they are denying a key Scottish industry the support it needs, support the drinks industry in the rest of the UK receives, while hammering them with a tax increase at the same time. That's blatantly unfair to whisky and blatantly unfair to Scotland. Inflation is now predicted to come down sharply, he continued. It's time for the Prime Minister to bring fairness back to the way whisky is treated, and I will make that crystal clear when we meet today. So, William, first of all, in addition to raising the case of the astonishing rise in the duty on Scotch whisky, what else would you like to hear Humza Yousaf explaining or discussing with Rishi Sunak when they meet today for the first time?
I think it's quite important. I know they've already had a conversation by phone just after Humza Yousaf was elected, but I think it's important that he discusses the relationship between the two governments and how it can actually become slightly more productive, because we're seeing increasing amounts of what I would term interference or possibly also saber rattling about the devolution settlement. I'm not a great fan of devolution because I'd like much more, but I wouldn't want devolution rolled back in any way, shape, or form. And some of the things we've been hearing, for example, from Lord Frost, are not acceptable. They're not acceptable even to the Scottish Tories, who see it as an electoral disaster for them. And I really think Humza should be in the business of establishing better relations between the two governments. There's been just too much sniping going on. It's not as if Rishi Sunak doesn't himself have his troubles to seek, because there's the Dominic Raab affair, whereas Humza's got all the things going on with the SNP at the moment. So maybe they can have a kind of truce on that and just establish a proper, good and productive working relationship with a wee bit of mutual respect. And that would actually do for me, to be honest.
Thanks, William. And actually, you got in first there, because I was going to the next thing I was going to ask you is that, given that the former chief executive of the Scotch Whisky Association, Lord David Frost, is now a Tory peer and a doyen of the Telegraph reading classes, in raising the issue of the whisky industry today, do you think is Humza Yousaf trying to push Tory tanks off Scotland's lawn a little bit in that area, or is he trying to expose Frost as not having the support in the Tory party that Frost maybe believes that he has?
Well, it certainly is a chance to bring Lord Frost into the conversation, isn't it? What a coincidence! He happens to have been in on this, and so we'll just mention him. I think the Tory tanks off the lawn is what I would like to see, because it's not helping anybody, and it certainly isn't helping, as I said, the Scottish Tories, who must be a wee bit frightened with what they see possibly as what would be an electoral opportunity for them being squandered by some of the nasty talk that's been going on. It's just important, though, that the two build a working relationship, because devolution is meant to work on a cooperative basis. Whatever the constitutional settlement ultimately turns out to be, it's in nobody's interest to have a snipe war. So I'm sure Lord Frost will come into the discussions, and I would love to see those Tory tanks roll very much off the grass and down the road.
Thanks, William. And there was one broader question I was going to ask you, just to get your thoughts. I wondered whether there is more that connects Humza Yousaf and Rishi Sunak than divides them. I'm being slightly contentious here, but bear with me. Both of them have East Asian heritage, of which they are rightly very proud, and they're both privately educated. Though I doubt Sunak ever worked in an O2 call centre. So, do you think is there enough shared understanding and shared background and hinterland between the two that kind of cooperation, or at least understanding that you were talking about, has some chance of being established?
Well, I would hope there would be some opportunity for that, given, if you like, some of the things they share. One of the things they very much don't share is that Rishi Sunak is incredibly rich and married very, very well. And so when we hear the hi, I'm Rishi sort of approach to things about all sorts of things, I mean, that's the sort of persona he's trying to project to the electorate. I'm afraid that is so far from reality, it's not true. So I think it might be a tall order to establish an absolute communality of thought. But I guess you're always, when you're negotiating with somebody and when you're trying to form a relationship, a business relationship with somebody, trying to find the things on which you can recognize each other.
Absolutely. Thanks, William. Now then, we'll move on to our next item this evening because the UK Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, has hinted at possible further military action to help UK citizens trapped in Sudan, and that the UK government recognises that the job is not done when it comes to rescuing the estimated 4,000 or more UK and dual nationals trapped in Sudan. The UK government is facing growing criticism over its decision to rescue only diplomats at the weekend, when other countries were evacuating diplomats and nationals. The minister said that discussions in government were continuing at pace, and that Rishi Sunak would be given options to help UK nationals trapped in Sudan as and when they arise. But he added that there was a concern that the military situation was highly unstable given the fighting between government and RSF rebel forces. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned today that the violence in Sudan risks a catastrophic conflagration within Sudan that could engulf the whole region and beyond, and he called on Security Council members to exert maximum leverage. Heapey said that Sunday's rescue involving two RAF planes, an Airbus A400M and a Hercules C-130, operating via the Akrotiri RAF base in Cyprus, went without a hitch. Planes landed via an airfield at Wadi Saidna, which is about 30 kilometres north of Khartoum, and the UK worked with France and Germany to fly in and out this weekend. He said Ministry of Defence continued to look at arranging further evacuations by air, road and sea, although nothing had yet been decided, and that Wadi Saidna airfield was small and only able to handle two A400M sized aircraft at any one time, limiting the number of people that could be evacuated at any one time. The UK Development Minister, Andrew Mitchell, had earlier said that UK nationals still in Sudan could be given assurances about evacuations. The UK airlifted its diplomats out of Sudan on Sunday, leaving other UK citizens behind, awaiting further instructions. Asked why diplomats but not citizens had been evacuated, Mitchell said, "We have a specific duty of care, a legal duty of care to our own staff and our diplomats, and that there had been a very specific threat to the diplomatic community in Khartoum." So, William, why do you think when France, Germany, Indonesia, Jordan, Italy, Saudi Arabia, and Spain, amongst others, have all been able to mobilise quickly and to extract their nationals, why do you think the UK's been unable to do so? As I said, there is currently estimated to be around 4,000 British nationals trapped there and in grave danger. And for their loved ones, every passing day must be a living nightmare.
Yeah. The first clue possibly is in the numbers. 4,000 is a lot more than the countries that you mentioned each had. And I suspect that's something that's holding them back. And the logistics of it are simply different for that kind of number. I suspect the United States is in a similar position because it has something like 16,000 people in Sudan. That's not an excuse because what it's not an excuse for is not really having any sort of obvious plan. And that's the thing that's slightly discomforting. Um, I think it's you need to be saying more to people than just remain indoors and wait for, well, what? That is the question. And it does raise the possibility that people eventually will lose faith and will try to make their own way out to who knows what and to face who knows what sort of dangers. So it is a tricky one for them, but it's not the first time that the UK has been under fire for not doing well with an evacuation. Afghanistan was very similar. And there is often the impression that the UK government just leaves you to get on with it when other countries are much more proactive. So I think at the very least, they need to be saying something a wee bit more positive about what their thinking is about where it's going and how they might at some point get folk out and how they can realistically stay safe insofar as you can predict that in the interim. And in the absence of that, then I'm afraid it's not good enough.
Well, you make a very good point there, William. British nationals stuck in the country have had to content themselves not with undercover rescue missions, but with text messages telling them to stay inside. This afternoon, the Foreign Affairs Committee Chair, Alicia Cairns, urged the UK government to get British citizens out of there, adding that if the UK is planning no or a minimal evacuation, then, and I quote, we must have the moral courage to tell British nationals that that is the case. So I wondered, do you think, is there any prospect of moral courage from a Tory government that some might say is largely bereft of morals?
Well, I'm not going to make moral judgments in the Tory government because we'll be here all night. But nevertheless, it is electorally significant if you gain and maintain the reputation for leaving your nationals in the lurch a little bit when other countries don't. Now you can say, well, that's the UK, it's not the Tories, but the Tories are the face of the UK, and they don't have their problems to seek electorally at the moment. So I think that the pressure will build, and they will have to do something, and they will have to look competent enough to have a plan. Whatever that plan might be, it needs to be enunciated. So something is going to happen. It's just going to be a wee bit behind. And will it be enough? Who knows?
Thanks, William. Now then, we'll move on to our next story now, because the Scottish Greens have said that the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, has clearly and demonstrably misled the House of Commons about Scotland's deposit return scheme. Scottish Green MSP Ross Greer has written to both the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, and the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, calling for an investigation into statements made by Mr Jack. In the letter, Mr Greer highlights in particular Mr Jack's claim in the House of Commons on the 22nd of February that no request had yet been received from the Scottish Government, despite a final detailed proposal having been submitted more than a week previously. In his letter to Sir Lindsay Hoyle, Mr Greer wrote, "It is abundantly clear that Mr Jack's attempts to convince the House of Commons that the Scottish Government had not sought an Internal Market Act exemption until March of this year is simply and categorically untrue." Mr Greer added that it was his firm belief that Mr Jack and the UK government have used the Brexit process to give themselves a new power of veto over the decisions of Scotland's elected Parliament via the Internal Market Act. Ross Greer called this a direct attack on Scotland's democracy. He also asked the Speaker to urgently investigate the situation he described and asked what action the Speaker will take in response to Mr Jack misleading the House of Commons. In his letter to Simon Case, the most senior civil servant in Whitehall, Greer asked for the confirmation that neither a formal nor an official request for an exclusion from the Internal Market Act is required. Ross Greer claimed that from the start, Alistair Jack has abused his position in a partisan and opportunistic bid to block the progress Scotland has been making on the deposit return scheme. Mr Greer said, "We cannot let these mistruths continue. It is bad enough that the Tories have used Brexit to give themselves this new power of veto over the Scottish Parliament, but to mislead the public about it is simply outrageous." Much of what Mr Jack has said is categorically untrue, and he knows it. There is no requirement for an official or formal request for exemption. He has simply made up a new process as some kind of sad power play against the Scottish Government. Mr Greer added, "The reality is that the Tories have shown a total contempt for our environment and for Scotland's democracy, and have turned to misdirection and distortion to cover that up. So, William, firstly, about the politics of this, do you think is the firing of letters back and forth, uh, including to Sir Lindsay Hoyle, going to achieve very much? Maybe it feels a tiny bit performative. And then thinking more widely about the politics, is doing that playing Alistair Jack's game, a game of delay and confusion, it is alleged, rather than simply pressing on with the Scottish Government's deposit return scheme and letting Alistair Jack play catch up.
Well, the delay is already built in because we know that the deposit return scheme will now be delayed. I think you're right about the performative nature of the exchange. And it's a classic example of what Hamza Yusuf and Rishi Sunak should be talking about in terms of how relations between the two governments currently are. Because what we seem to be seeing is he said, no, they said sort of debate about how this approach should be. Should it be informal? Should it be formal? It's almost like form-filling obstructiveness going on rather than a constructive relationship between the two countries. So it perhaps is also an indication of how tricky the Internal Market Act actually is, that it's not clear how there can be exceptions to it. And that's something that I think was predicted at the time that the Internal Market Act was passed. So it really needs sorting out because this kind of thing isn't going to be anything more than performative because I don't think Ross Greer's complaint will go anywhere. And in the meantime, we have uncertainty and we have the constant threat of somebody coming in and saying, no, you can't, left, right, and centre. So needs sorting out.
That's an interesting point that you make, William, insofar as we can see it in other areas. Obviously, the deposit return scheme has been under attack by unionist politicians and some businesses, unionist supporting businesses, but those attacks haven't really achieved a great deal so far. Do you think that the fact that there, so far as I can find out, there are no meaningful concrete plans at all for a deposit return scheme in England, does that tell us something about the true approach to the environment from a Tory government that has plenty of warm words but very little action?
Well, it depends what you mean by concrete plans, because there's kind of plans in 2025 for something. And part of the argument with Scotland is, why doesn't Scotland just wait for that to come along and be part of it? And the answer is because we were already a fair distance down the road in doing what we thought was the best one. Maybe there's more we can do to it in the meantime, and I'd certainly be very interested in further pursuit of exceptions for smaller businesses initially till we get the thing up and running. And we certainly need to get away from the rhetoric of it being a catastrophe for business, which didn't really, I think, help anybody. It's been okay with other countries. Other countries have managed it. It's not impossible. And certainly we should be doing a wee bit more work on getting across how the scheme should be working. What England will do with it, I suspect they will come out with something that kind of works, maybe isn't as ambitious as ours, but I don't think necessarily that the Tories have a lack of morals about it. They just haven't worked out possibly how they're going to make money from it yet.
That's a very acute observation, and that probably would be the answer. If there was more money to be made, we would see more activity from a Westminster government in that direction. Let's move on now, because 9 European countries have pledged to multiply the capacity of offshore wind farms in the North Sea by 8 times the current levels before 2050, turning it into what Belgium's energy minister called Europe's biggest green power plant. The French President Emmanuel Macron, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and the European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen signed the declaration today with the Prime Ministers of Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, and Luxembourg. Norway's Prime Minister and the UK's Energy Minister also committed at a summit in Ostend in Belgium to build more wind farms, develop energy islands which are connected renewable generation sites at sea and to work on carbon capture projects. We are unlocking our offshore energy ambitions, the Belgian energy minister, Tina van der Streeten, said. Coordination is absolutely essential. If each of the 9 countries acts alone, collectively we will fail. Planning is at the core of everything. Aiming to curb reliance on Russian gas and radically reduce the use of CO2 emitting fossil fuels, the 9 countries were set to target a combined 120 gigawatts of North Sea offshore wind capacity by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. The targets represent a further doubling of the capacity goals announced at a similar 4-country summit in Esbjerg in Denmark in May last year, 3 months after the European energy markets were plunged into turmoil by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Belgium's Prime Minister Alexander De Croo said developments since then meant energy was more than ever a geopolitical topic, and the summit would standardise infrastructure to ensure North Sea wind farms could be built faster and cheaper. The Netherlands and the UK announced plans for Europe's biggest cross-border electricity link connected to an offshore wind farm, while the EU and Norway pledged to develop infrastructure to capture and store CO2 from depleted North Sea gas fields. The UK has 45 offshore wind farms producing 14 gigawatts, with plans to expand capacity to 50 gigawatts by 2030, including offshore wind farms in the Scottish North Sea sector. Scotland alone has a renewable energy capacity of 42 gigawatts planned by 2030. Germany has 30 plans producing 8 gigawatts, followed by the Netherlands with 2.8 gigawatts and Denmark and Belgium both with 2.3 gigawatts. France aims to expand massively to 40 gigawatts by 2050, an official said. They added, offshore wind energy will probably be the main source of renewable energy production between 2030 and 2050, far ahead of solar energy and land wind farms. The investment required to ensure the North Sea wind energy targets are met is huge. The EU recently calculated that €800 billion would be needed to reach 300 gigawatts by 2050, and wind energy companies have said that significant state funding will be essential. So, William, as I was just saying, the investment required to ensure that the targets are met is estimated by the EU to be around €800 billion. That's in order to reach 300 gigawatts by 2050. So, do you think how much of that investment in the current political setup in which Scotland sits, how much of that investment do you think will be spent in Scotland?
Well, I think it would be nice if a fair bit of it were, because it's an area where we should be capable of developing our expertise and our capacity far more than we currently have. But how the money will be spent and where it will be spent will be under the control of the UK government, I suspect. And so I don't really know to what extent we will benefit in terms of jobs and investment. And what had happened, though, with the massive investment that is required is that probably our energy bills will not be coming down for quite some time to come. That's something I think I can predict with a little bit of confidence. Overall, I think it's necessary that somehow the investment goes in and that we get this up to the capacity that we require, because it's too easy at the minute just to say, well, let's just carry on with oil and gas a little bit longer. It's all right, don't just keep it in the ground, use it as a bridge. We need to be building our own bridges and getting into a situation where we are free of fossil fuels as soon as we possibly can, because it's now urgent, as we can see almost every day with another new weather thing happening and with other evidence of what's going on. So I do applaud it. It's still to have the I's dotted and the T's crossed in terms of the financing of it over the next 27 odd years.
That's a very good point, William. And we know that access charges to the grid in the UK are highest in the north of Scotland. Might this proposed international collaboration across the North Sea give Scotland the chance to export some of our excess green electricity direct to other markets, short-circuiting, if you will, the national grid in the UK?
It's an intriguing thought. Yes, maybe it could. I think, by the way, the cost of connecting to the grid is another thing that Hamza should be talking to Rishi about. It's an absolute disgrace that this has gone on. It had historical reasons for being the case. They don't any longer exist, and there should not be that competitive disadvantage in yet another area. So he's got quite a lot on his plate as Hamza on the agenda for tonight, I think.
He certainly does. He certainly does, William. Thank you. We'll move on to our next item now, because hundreds of asylum seeker children are wrongly being treated as adults by the Home Office, according to data from dozens of local authorities. Responses from Freedom of Information requests showed that two-thirds of children, 867 out of 1,386, deemed by the Home Office to be adults, were later confirmed to be children. A report that collated the data from these FOI responses from 70 different local authorities about age assessments carried out by specialist social workers on age-disputed young asylum seekers said that the number is likely to be an underestimate. The authors of the report, the charities Helen Bamber Foundation, Humans for Rights Network, and Asylum Aid, said that not all councils responded to the FOI request, and that some children wrongly classified as adults by the Home Office are never referred for a detailed age assessment social worker, so do not have the opportunity to have their age corrected. Wrongly classifying children as adults mean that they could be placed alone in unsupervised accommodation alongside adults they do not know, or they could be wrongly placed in adult immigration detention centres. Some children as young as 14 have been forced to share rooms with unrelated adults, according to the report. The findings have emerged in the week the government will debate amendments to the illegal migration bill. One amendment, announced on Friday evening, states it seeks increasing protections around the safeguarding risk caused by adults pretending to be children. It is introducing scientific age assessments and adds that any age-disputed person who refuses to undergo a scientific age assessment test will automatically be treated as an adult. The new plans will give children no right to appeal against incorrect age assessments and will also reduce access to judicial review as a mechanism to challenge these decisions. Yet, in January 2023, the government's own Scientific Advisory Committee warned that plans to use X-rays to check the age of children seeking asylum could put them at risk of harm from radiation and cause distress. The advisors said it was not possible to scientifically confirm a person's age with precision. So, William, these children are living in isolated hotels with unrelated adults and are frequently distressed, traumatized, and afraid. So, is this evidence more evidence that the Westminster government is treating young asylum seekers almost as badly as it treats other young, poor people?
Well, one wouldn't expect the Westminster government to treat them any better, but nevertheless, it is another example of an asylum system that is not functioning properly, and that the government doesn't seem to have any great interest in making function properly because, one, it costs too much money, and two, it's not what they're interested in putting across to their core electorate, which is more of the hostile environment. So, yeah, it's bad. It's bad treatment. I know that there is a safeguarding risk in simply accepting that I'm getting this the wrong way around now, but there's a safeguarding risk either way. Let's put it that way. But they're not getting it right, and that's the important thing. More often than not, they're not getting it right, and that's something that they really need to work on how they can get round, because these people, whatever age they are already traumatized and suffering from mental health issues in many cases, perfectly understandably, when they get here. We need to do away with a hostile environment. We need to get something that functions and that actually turns things around properly and gets people integrated into normal life if they're staying, and removes them elegantly if they're not staying. And that's the fundamental underlying issue we've got. That currently the asylum system is not fit for purpose. This is just another example of it.
Thank you, William. Yes, we've spoken a few times about the extent to which the Home Office is unfit for purpose and has been so for a very long time, and shows no sign of being reformed or any more fit for purpose than it currently is and than it should be. So, thank you. We'll move on now and look at another aspect of the UK's asylum and refugee scheme, because more than 830 UK health professionals and representatives from leading medical bodies have signed a letter to the Prime Minister expressing grave concerns that the government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda will cause catastrophic mental and physical harm to people who are seeking safety. And that's in advance of a court hearing regarding the policy that's been held today. Signatories to the letter include the BMA and the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists. Subjecting people to seeking sanctuary in the UK, many of whom have mental health conditions and have histories of torture, trafficking and trauma, to such an inhumane process is a matter of significant concern for the medical community, the letter says. Like Brexit, the government's plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda has split the UK down the middle. According to a poll carried out by the More in Common think tank earlier this month, almost half of those surveyed, 46%, back the deal, which was announced just over a year ago. The deal has so far cost the UK £140 million, although no asylum seekers have yet been sent to the East African country. The Rwanda plans have been criticised by many human rights organisations. The UN's Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons has been granted permission to intervene in this week's Court of Appeal hearing, along with the UNHCR. The government has pledged to start sending asylum seekers to Rwanda as soon as legal proceedings have concluded. So, William, as we know, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has made Stop the Boats, quote unquote, one of his key undertakings before the next election in 2024. Do you think, has the penny dropped with him yet, that Priti Patel's solution of offshoring asylum seekers to Rwanda simply will not work?
Well, it clearly hasn't dropped yet, or they would have dropped their defence of the case. It's still, I mean, the 46% that back the deal with Rwanda, a lot of them will be core Tory voters, and therefore they're pursuing it on those grounds, I suppose. But I do think that, again, you've spent 140 million on this and achieved nothing. You could have spent some of that, or all of that, plus a bit more, on, again, building a functioning system. The way you stop the boats, which I think are a good thing to stop because they are dangerous, is to construct feasible routes for people legally to come here and have their asylum claims judged in a timely and fair fashion. And we're just nowhere near even looking at that. We're just basically continuing with the same plan, and with the photo opportunities for Suella Braverman most lately in Rwanda. It's just nasty stuff, and it's unnecessary for a group of people who are as traumatized as any individual that are reaching our shores. So, yeah, I wait to see what the court hearing comes up with today, but I don't hold out any great hope of anything changing or the penny dropping with the Tories soon.
Absolutely, William. Now, in response to this story today, the Home Office said individuals who are eligible for relocation will have all their needs looked after while their asylum claims are being considered in Rwanda, including having access to safe and clean accommodation and healthcare. But it struck me reading that statement, what happens to these people after the asylum claims have been granted, or worse, refused, and they find themselves still in Rwanda?
I honestly don't know, but it is a difficult question to answer. But it's going to be particularly difficult for them. It's basically sweeping things under the carpet as far as the UK's responsibility for these folk goes. Now, of course, the UK ceases to have responsibility if the claim is turned down, but you also have to have an elegant way, as I said, of getting people to somewhere else where hopefully they'll be safe, even if it isn't here. That's how a proper asylum system should work. And it's a dereliction of duty to just basically ship them out to Rwanda and leave them there in the event that you deny the claim.
Thank you, William. That's absolutely right. Now, we were talking earlier on with regard to the meeting this evening between the First Minister and the Prime Minister, and a statement has just arrived from the Scottish Government since we came on air. So it's quite short, so we'll look at that because it answers a couple of the questions that we were discussing. It says the First Minister and the Prime Minister met this evening. The First Minister raised the cost of living crisis and rising energy bills being suffered by households across Scotland. He was pleased that the Prime Minister committed to fairness in how the Scotch whisky industry is treated by the UK government. He now needs to deliver on that. The First Minister raised concerns around UK government attacks on devolution, including the Foreign Secretary's clumsy intervention on Scottish government activity abroad and comments on devolution from Lord Frost. He also once again pressed for an exemption to the Internal Market Act for the deposit return scheme to be granted within weeks. The First Minister also made clear that he expects the Prime Minister to respect the democratic wishes of Scotland's Parliament by granting a Section 30 order. So, William, that's a quick update. It sounds like there was a reasonable shopping list of matters to be discussed there, and you would hope that having opened up those discussions, that as you and I were discussing, that the Prime Minister and the First Minister are able to establish at least a civil dialogue and perhaps begin to build some kind of platform in which the two governments can begin to work together rather than simply rattling sabres and sending letters to each other. Now then, we'll move on now, however, because more than 100 Israeli and international civil society organisations have asked the United Nations to reject a controversial definition of anti-Semitism because it is being misused to protect Israel from legitimate criticism. The groups have written to the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, saying he should resist pressure from Israel to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, their working definition of anti-Semitism. The definition has already been accepted by the US State Department, several European governments, including the UK and Germany, and by EU bodies after strong lobbying by pro-Israel groups and others. Adoption of the definition by governments and institutions is often framed as an essential step in efforts to combat anti-Semitism. In practice, however, the IHRA definition is often been used to wrongly label criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, and thus chill and sometimes suppress non-violent protest, activism and speech that is critical of Israel and or Zionism, including in the US and Europe, the letter said. Signatories include Israel's largest human rights group, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Israeli and Palestinian civil society groups. Some of the signatories are concerned that if Guterres formally adopts the definition, it will be used to curb criticism of Israeli policies by UN bodies, including the Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Territories. The letter notes that the application of the definition has been widely criticised, including by Ken Stern, who, as the American Jewish Committee's anti-Semitism expert, led its drafting 2 decades ago. The letter to Guterres says the problem lies with 7 of the 11 contemporary examples of anti-Semitism attached to the definition to guide its application. The letter said one example can be used to suppress claims that Israel is breaching international laws against apartheid and is violating conventions to end race discrimination. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have both been accused of anti-Semitism under the IHRA definition over detailed reports saying that Israel practices a form of apartheid, an accusation also levelled by Israeli human rights groups. The groups say that the IHRA definition has been used to muzzle legitimate speech and activism by critics of Israel's human rights record and advocates for Palestinian rights. The definition has been widely adopted amid lobbying by groups such as the Anti-Defamation League in the US and the Board of Deputies of British Jews in the UK, but criticism has also grown over the years. In 2017, Ken Stern told the US Congress that there was a double standard in the application of the IHRA definition because there are pro-Israel groups that freely deny the Palestinian people's rights to their own self-determination and the right of Palestine to exist. So, William, bringing this back to politics in the UK today, given what happened to Jeremy Corbyn and now appears to be happening to Diane Abbott, should we all be thinking a little bit harder about adopting this apparently contentious definition of anti-Semitism, bearing in mind that the Labour Party adopted this definition in 2018?
Well, it's clearly it's a problematic definition, and so yes, I think we maybe should be thinking a wee bit more broadly about things rather than the sort of black and white sort of approach that we seem to be taking. And there were, of course, political reasons why the Labour Party wanted to suppress Jeremy Corbyn. There may even be reasons why they're not too keen to have Diane Abbott around for any length of time. And that is the dirty politics that we tend to have. And of course, we're not alone in that, but hey, it's just part of life. More generally, though, I mean, it's not so much the definition as the way it is being applied, because Ken Stern, whom you mentioned, was one of the authors of it, and it wasn't his intention that it be used as the blunt instrument that it's being used as. So I think it's maybe time to look at it again. And of course, you've got to be aware of the dangers of watering it down too much so that it can be used as a blunt instrument in the other direction. So it is a dilemma. But I just think people need to be a little bit more, I don't know, imaginative or just sensible about how they treat things. There is a clear double standard going on with Israel and with Palestine. And it's not anti-Semitic just to say that. A double standard is a double standard and is obvious to everybody. And certainly the discussion of it in this country needs to be tempered with a little bit more grace and understanding, I think.
Calm and rational discussions and grace and understanding. You'll never make a politician, William. I'm sorry. It's not going to
Good.
work. Thank you. But that's a great position and a very clear explanation as to what we would all hope can be done with regard to the definition of anti-Semitism, especially in light of what Ken Stern has been saying. But let's move on now, because a record number of adult heart transplants were performed at the NHS Golden Jubilee in 2022-2023. Specialists at the Scottish National Advanced Heart Failure Service, based at the Golden Jubilee University National Hospital, have carried out 40 life-saving operations, a record number in 1 year for the National Service. The previous highest number of heart transplants in Scotland was 34 in 1995-96. The Golden Jubilee's previous highest year was 24 in 2019-2020. Innovation in technique and advancements in technology, such as an organ care system to allow surgeons to transplant hearts from donors who die after circulatory death, have increased the availability of hearts for transplant, and have also boosted the success rate, which is currently at 95% for 90-day survival. The SNAHFS team aims to build on this year's transplant figure, which brings the total number to 490 since the first was performed in January 1992. The first 280 operations took place at Glasgow Royal Infirmary before the service was moved to the Golden Jubilee in 2008. The Health Secretary Michael Matheson visited the unit today to mark the record year. He said, "It is a remarkable achievement to perform 40 life-saving operations in a year, and my thanks go to all the staff at the heart transplant unit for their skill and dedication in making this happen. It is truly life-saving for patients." He went on, "The unit has gone from strength to strength since its launch more than 30 years ago, and with today's medical advances, it is amazing so many people being given a new lease of life. We must also remember the donors, and we thank each and every one of them and their families for this gift of life." The Golden Jubilee University's National Hospital's Heart Surgery Department also performs a wide range of procedures: coronary artery bypass grafts, valve surgery to repair or replace valves, adult congenital cardiac surgery procedures, and other open heart surgical procedures. So, William, do you think is this a good news story for the new Health Secretary Michael Matheson, as well as a very good news story for the increased numbers of patients who've been receiving this care at the Golden Jubilee?
Well, certainly, I'm sure Michael Matheson will be happy for any good news story he can get, and he has been obviously visiting a lot of places in his first couple of weeks and getting his feet under the table. It's a difficult brief, so anything that is a good news story, yes, is good news for him, but it is a good news story in its own right. It's a story of medical advances that are making more hearts available for transplant, and that's important. 40 is a tremendous figure. Obviously, the figures will have been constrained in the last couple of years, but it's much higher than the 24, as you said, that was recorded just 2 or 3 years ago, and that is in itself an indication of how things have changed. And yeah, a good news story for the Scottish NHS. It's the smallest such unit. The Scottish one is in the UK, I believe. And so it's looking like it's beginning to punch above its weight. And long may that continue.
Absolutely. Thank you, William. But now let's move on to our final item this evening, because the Proclaimers song, I'm Gonna Be 500 Miles, has been removed from the official coronation celebration playlist after complaints about its inclusion. The Edinburgh duo are supporters of Scottish independence and Republicans who have been vocal about their views at various points throughout their careers. Last September, Charlie Reid stated his support for Simon Hill, an author and tutor who was initially charged for using threatening or abusive words or disorderly behaviour during a proclamation ceremony for King Charles in Oxford. Hill shouted, "Who elected him?" before being taken into a police van. His case was later dropped by the Crown Prosecution Service. Charlie Reid said at the time, "I thought that guy spoke for me, and he speaks for loads of other people, not just in Scotland, right around the UK." On the Queen's death, Charlie Reid said, "Loads of people are like me. They had a personal respect for the woman, but they do not support the monarchy." When Scotland becomes independent, the Proclaimers, in common with many Scots, believe a referendum should be put to the Scottish people about becoming a republic. A poll last year found that only 45% of people in Scotland wanted to keep the monarchy. The Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport said that the playlist had been created to celebrate British and Commonwealth artists ahead of the upcoming coronation. So, William, is this story just another wee bit of fluff around the coronation spinach quiche, anyone? Or does it matter a little bit more in terms of expressing the views of people who do not support the monarchy and do not support that institution?
Well, I don't think the Proclaimers will be in the slightest worried that I'm going to be 500 miles is not on the playlist. However, I think it's reasonable to say that the playlist should reflect the views of everybody in the country, if insofar as it's reflecting views at all, because it's just part of the culture, if you like, of the UK as it's viewed. And Scotland needs to be part of that, and the Proclaimers are an important part of Scotland. I'd be very interested to know who was complaining about them. And I'd also be interested to know if the other people in the playlist have been investigated for their Republican sympathies and whether any have been found. But hey, I don't particularly mind about it any more than the Proclaimers do. It's just another thing that goes on in the nonsense that's beginning to build towards May the 6th. And I don't know where you're going to be on that day, but I'm going to be just 400 miles from London and Glasgow at the AUOB March. So there.
There we go. Thanks, William. And actually, you anticipate a question I was going to ask you. I noticed that "Slave to the Rhythm" by Grace Jones is still on the playlist, with her Jamaican heritage and, what can I say, fiery persona. Do you think has anyone dared ask her yet what she thinks?
Well, I wouldn't, would you? Not without severe body armor.
Absolutely. And finally, William, is there anything else in particular that you would like to see on the playlist?
Gosh. Well, it has to be by somebody British because obviously the King, Elvis Presley, can't be on it. I suppose Queen could be on it, but
They
Prince
are on it.
can't. I'm sad to say.
There we
So
go.
there you
That's
are.
absolutely ideal. Perfect. Thank you, William. Thank you very much. Because I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. So we will be back tomorrow evening at 7 for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest this Monday evening, William Duguid. Thanks, William.
And thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. On this day in 1558, the 15-year-old Mary, Queen of Scots, married the 14-year-old Françoise, the Dauphin of France, in Paris. The wedding was accompanied by an agreement that will unify the crowns of Scotland and France if there are children of the marriage, or will hand over the crown of Scotland to France if there are not. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening and you don't get your head chopped off. Bye-bye.